Anatomy 32, Chapter 21, Special Senses. Topics: Olfaction and Gustation. So the special senses are the sensations localized to the head. They include things like the gustation or taste, vision, olfaction or smell, hearing, and equilibrium. Olfaction. The sensory tissue for olfaction is found in the roof of the nasal cavity, lying directly below or in contact with the cribriform plate, and is referred to as the olfactory epithelium. When we look at closer look at the olfactory epithelium, we see that it has many epithelial cells, olfactory epithelial cells that provide structural support and also produce mucus, so that there'll be a layer of mucus on the surface of the olfactory epithelium. And then there are also some glands that also produce mucus. And then there are the olfactory receptors. The olfactory receptors are first-order sensory neurons. So the sensory neurons are themselves the receptors, and these sensory neurons have little hair cells that stick out into the mucus. And chemicals that can dissolve in the mucus bind to receptors on the olfactory hairs, and this is the stimulation that leads to a signal. So it is the binding of chemicals that leads to the sensation of smell. And so when stimulated, the olfactory receptors will send a nerve signal up through the cribriform plate to the brain. There are 7 primary odors that everyone should be able to detect. These include musky, putrid, pungent, camphoraceous, ethereal, floral, and minty. You don't need to remember those 7, but I find it kind of interesting. Turns out overall, though, humans can detect thousands of different smells, thousands of different chemicals as odorants. However, those thousands can vary from person to person, so some people can smell some things and other people smell other things, which could be why one person smells something and says it smells great, and another person smells it and is unimpressed. So again, the olfactory epithelial cells are the support cells that provide physical support and nourishment and stimulation for the olfactory receptor cells. And then there are also basal cells, and the basal cells are olfactory receptor stem cells. And so what this means is that there are constantly new neurons growing in the olfactory epithelium, which is pretty amazing. There's not a lot of places in the body where that occurs. And then, as I mentioned before, the olfactory glands, which help to produce additional mucus to lie on the surface of the olfactory epithelium. And of course, the odorants, the chemicals that we can detect, have to be able to dissolve in the mucus. The chemicals must be able to dissolve in the mucus and bind to their individual receptors. So after the signal gets transmitted, it gets transmitted up through the first-order sensory neurons up to the olfactory bulb. Olfactory bulb is officially part of the brain, so that means technically the olfactory nerve are all those many fibers moving through the cribriform plate to the olfactory bulb. And then there's a synapsing there to the second-order sensory neurons that send the signal to the brain. So there are only 2 sensory neurons in a row, no third-order somatic sensory neurons. That signal then goes to the temporal lobe, to the primary olfactory area in the temporal lobe. And it bypasses the thalamus. This is the only sense that bypasses the thalamus. So again, olfactory epithelium carries the sensation to the olfactory bulb, and then from there, via the olfactory tract to the primary olfactory area in the temporal lobe. Gustation. Gustation, or the sense of taste, is localized to the mouth, specifically to the superior surface of the tongue. And on the tongue, we find many papillae or bumps, and many of these papillae possess taste buds. So we have the valette papilla. The valette papilla are rather large structures that form an inverted V toward the posterior of the tongue. They do indeed possess taste buds. Then there are the fungiform papillae that are scattered all over the surface of the tongue. They're somewhat mushroom-shaped, hence fungi form papillae. They also possess taste buds. There are the folate papillae found in the lateral trenches of the tongue, and these have taste buds that are only active in young children. And then finally, there are filiform papillae, again found all over the surface of the tongue. However, the filiform papillae lack taste buds. There's no taste function for them. Their job primarily is to provide a rough surface to the tongue, which helps the tongue then be able to manipulate food in the mouth. All right, here's a close-up of a taste bud. And there are three different cells. There are the basal cells. The basal cells are stem cells that then grow to form the support cells. Support cells will surround the gustatory receptor cells, providing support, nourishment, etc. And then the support cells themselves can differentiate into the gustatory receptors. So the gustatory receptors are the third kind of cells, and they possess these single long microvillus, this protuberance that sticks out of the taste bud and is lying on the surface of the tongue. And it's there that there are the receptors for the tastants, or the chemicals that bind to the receptors. And so we need chemicals that can dissolve in saliva and bind to receptors on the gustatory receptor cells to get a signal. And then the gustatory receptor cells synapse with sensory neurons. And so first order sensory neurons then carry the signal to the brain. So the receptor cells are distinct from the sensory neuron. So there are 5 primary tastes that we can detect: sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and umami. Umami is a Japanese word. These receptors, the sensation was detected by a Japanese scientist, and it means savory or meaty. And a chemical that can stimulate the umami sensation is monosodium glutamate. That's why that often gets added to foods. And again, the chemicals, the tastants, must be able to dissolve in saliva in order to bind to receptors on the gustatory receptor cells. Now, there are probably additional taste sensations that we just haven't discovered yet. For instance, we can definitely tell the difference between foods or drinks that have a higher fat content. All right, the gustatory pathway. So we have the first order sensory neurons within the tongue that are synapsing with the taste buds, and they carry the signals to the brain via either the facial nerve for the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, the glossopharyngeal nerve for the posterior third of the tongue, and the vagus nerve for a few scattered taste buds on the epiglottis and pharynx, although I'm not really going to talk about that ever again. So the main ones are from the facial nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve. They then enter the medulla oblongata and synapse with the second order sensory neuron that carries the sensation to the thalamus, and there it synapses with the third order sensory neuron, carrying it to the primary gustatory area in the parietal lobe. And that is it for this part of the lecture.